So a question, actually two questions that are fairly similar. So the first one is, can I ask you to talk about the atrocities committed right now in the Middle East, since it's all affecting us spiritually and we have hard times living with these horrors happening in that part of the world? Second question, is there any way you could talk about how we can psychologically deal with the many horrific things happening on the planet? Generally, I can maintain a positive attitude, but when I hear stories of children and families being tortured and killed, and many atrocities on this planet, I have a really hard time not reacting. I find that I feel a sense of deep frustration and even anger at the fallen beings for what they do, but also at the general populace because they are so complacent. I've really been working on this as part of my birth trauma the past couple of years, but any help you may offer would be appreciated. Okay, so I totally understand these questions. I totally understand these questions. I have said it before, actually, that I started out as an empath. You know, I'm very empathetic towards other people's suffering. I feel really bad. Even as a child, when I saw these children starving in Africa, I felt really bad about it. All of my life, I have felt very affected by this, learning about the Holocaust, wars, and torture especially. It's difficult to deal with. So I totally understand the question. I have actually addressed these issues in another video where I talk about, is the world getting worse or better? And so I encourage you, if you're interested in this question, to watch that video, because I go into more depth than I'll do here. And I would also say that many of the people who feel this way, who feel disturbed by what's happening on the planet, it's very likely that you are an avatar. So you can benefit from watching my avatar videos, because I also address these questions there on how we deal with suffering. But what I would say, without going into too long of a discourse here, is that for me, the way I kind of got a little less disturbed by what's happening on the planet was by realizing free will, the importance of free will. And it was a long process, you know, it took me a long time. But it really boils down to two things. First of all, the teachings of the Ascended Masters. Second of all, my experience of being on Earth. And the teaching of the Ascended Masters state that the ultimate law for this planet is free will. In other words, people have to be allowed to live out whatever tendencies they have in their minds, whatever attitudes, whatever mindset they have. They must be allowed to live it out and experience the consequences of their mindset. The Masters are saying that they are constantly offering us spiritual teachings so we can learn through spiritual teachings. But they also say that we all have a need to have certain physical experiences where we simply we outplay a certain mindset and we experience the physical consequences of it. In extreme ways, you could say, if you have this very antagonistic attitude to other people, us versus them, or we are right and they are wrong, you're in the duality consciousness, you need to experience a certain amount of conflict where you realize that you simply experience that what war means, and it leads to destruction for everybody. And this is what the Ascended Masters call the School of Hard Knocks. And the Ascended Masters are explaining that the majority of the people on Earth are in the School of Hard Knocks, where they are not open to a spiritual teaching. The Ascended Masters can't reach most people. So that's why groups of people become substitute teachers. They don't want to listen to the real teachers, the spiritual teachers, the Ascended Masters. So people become substitute teachers for each other, because two groups of people clash because they have the opposite polarities in the dualistic polarity, and they simply have to experience this a certain number of times before they've had enough of it. So that was one thing. It helped me to come to understand this. But the other was that I simply experienced, but you can't convince people. I thought, when I was 18 years old and I found the spiritual path, I thought, wow, we could solve all problems on earth if people would realize the spiritual path and karma and love, and if they could feel love from above, they wouldn't have to fight. And we could just, and I thought, everybody wants this. Everybody wants to hear about this. It must be because for some reason it just hasn't been talked about. People haven't discovered the spiritual path, but now that I have, certainly everybody wants to hear about it. And my experience was, of course, nobody wants to hear about it. Hello, Kim. You may have discovered the spiritual path, but nobody else wants to hear about it. And so over the years, you come to this where you realize most people you can't reach. The ascended masters can't reach them, but you can't either, even though you're in embodiment. It doesn't matter what you say, what argument you come up with. And so you come to a point where you look at this and you say, these people are unreachable for the ascended masters, for us who are in embodiment and have a spiritual outlook. We cannot reach them. How are you going to reach them? So therefore you have to resign yourself, or at least I did. I resigned myself to the fact that most people are in the school of hard knocks. And I just have to allow them to outplay what they need to outplay until they've had enough of it. And as I said, I grew up in Europe. I grew up in Denmark. And Denmark is a very peaceful country. A lot of equality, not so big a difference between rich and poor. No corruption, basically no corruption. Very high social awareness. And I simply had to come to a point where I had to realize that there are some countries in the world, most of the democratic nations, where the people who embody there, they have over many lifetimes, they've overcome the most aggressive tendencies. So they are still not, most of them, open to a spiritual teaching. But they have actually embodied spiritual teachings, the golden rule, for example, do unto others. I mean, I look at most people I grew up with in Denmark. They were not aggressive people. They were not lying. They were not cheating. They were not manipulating others. They, without being Christian, they never saw themselves as Christians. They would have objected if you called them Christians. But they embodied the golden rule. And many people do. So what I've come to realize is that you can look at it very simply. You can take the golden rule. Almost every religion teaches the golden rule. So you can simply say, you look at the world and you can see there are some countries where most people have, in past lifetimes, often over many long lifetimes with a lot of conflict, a lot of experiences, they have come to embody the golden rule. They are not doing to other people what they don't want others to do to them. That's what I call basic humanity. And if you have overcome that too and embodied the golden rule, that's why you were born in one of these countries. Now, be careful here. I'm not saying that if you were born in another country, it means you haven't embodied the golden rule, because if you're a spiritual person, you have. But I'm just saying, I came to the conclusion that most people who are born in peaceful nations is because in past lives they overcame this. You look at some of the other nations that are not peaceful and you realize most people there, they have not yet embodied the golden rule. So they're still in the school of hard knocks. And that means you can't talk to them, you can't reach them. You just have to let them outplay what they want to outplay, and then as much as possible stay out of the way. And what I came to the conclusion was that I simply said, okay, how likely is it that in my lifetime we will have peace on earth and goodwill among men? Is that likely to happen? And I very much see that there will be improvements, but I don't think we will overcome all conflicts. Because there are simply some groups of people that are in such a low level of consciousness, they are not likely to make it in the next 20, 30 years. So I simply said to myself, okay, so there are people who are in the school of hard knocks. They need to outplay their aggression. But does that mean I have to put my attention on it? Does that mean I have to read every news article about what's going on in the Middle East, for example? Do I really have to put my attention on this? Do I have to feel empathy with these people who will not listen to anybody? I mean, you're talking about the Middle East, but look at how many other regions of the world where you have a similar dynamic of groups of people who are fighting against each other. And it's simply, again, they haven't embodied the golden rule. They may claim to be very devout Muslims, very devout Jews, very devout Christians, but they haven't embodied the golden rule, which is what I call basic humanity. It is simply the basic level of humanity. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. And if they haven't embodied the golden rule, it's very, very simple. They are not open to listening to anybody telling them, you need a change. You're hurting yourself. Are you stupid or what? They don't want to hear it. And they'll get very aggressive, very angry if you try to tell them. I never forget in 2009, I was in Israel. Spent some time in Jerusalem, but also drove around the country. And I had a few talks with some Jewish people, but more with some Palestinians. And I realized after talking to these people that Jews and Palestinians will never make peace. Jews and Arabs will never make peace. And the reason why I'm saying this is that I realized that when you have grown up in a democratic country, peaceful country, where people embody the golden rule, when you embody the golden rule, you don't see other people as your enemies. You don't have the us versus them mentality. So you identify yourself as a human being. But Jews have not grown up to identify themselves as human beings. They have grown up to identify themselves as Jews. And Palestinians have grown up to identify themselves as Palestinians or Arabs. And in that identity that they have grown up with, they are in an existential conflict with the other group, Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims. It's in their identity minds, the highest level of their mind. They see themselves in opposition to each other. And when you have that sense of identity, you cannot make peace. The only way there can be peace is if both groups come to the point where they embody the golden rule, they acquire this basic humanity, where they see, yes, we may be Jews and Arabs, but that's a cultural overlay. Behind this, we are human beings, or rather spiritual beings. But even if they could see that behind all of the outer characteristics, there is a common denominator of being a human being. All people on earth are human beings. We are human beings first. That's the highest level of identity. Well, it's the second highest, because the highest is we are spiritual beings. But we are human beings. Universal way of looking at our identity, we are human beings. And then below that comes all the other things, religion, race, sex, nationality, all of this stuff. This is secondary. And if you could see that, then you can make peace, because then you can say we can find a way to interact. And there's actually, in Spain, in the Middle Ages, there was in the southern Spain, there was a community called Al-Andalus, where Jews, Christians, and Arabs coexisted in peace because they identified themselves, first of all, as human beings. So there are examples that this can be done. And I'm not saying it couldn't happen again, but right now it's not happening. And what Hamas did by attacking Israel, of course, didn't help. And what Israel is doing by attacking in a, I would say, rather disproportionate response is not helping either. So when is it going to happen? I don't know. But why should I concern myself about this? Why should I be disturbed about it? Why should I put my attention on it as a spiritual person? If I can't do anything about it, why should I put my attention on it? And so this goes back to the question, how can we as spiritual people avoid being disturbed by these events? So this has been my approach over the last several years. And as I've said before, I was really disturbed by the Ukraine war because I have been to Russia giving conferences. I've been to Ukraine giving a conference. I know many Russian spiritual people and Ukrainian spiritual people. And for me, they are just people, spiritual people. And I could see that this would be a disaster for both nations, this war. And I was disturbed by it in the beginning. But then I had to come to the point of saying, okay, is it really given where I'm at in my level of consciousness, is it really something I need to be disturbed by? I need to just let it outplay and whatever these people need to go through. Now, one thing I would say about the Israeli Hamas Palestinian situation is, and I know that Jews will probably be mortally offended by this, but I grew up in Denmark, and there was no persecution of Jews in Denmark. In fact, many Danes helped Jews escape to Sweden to get away from Hitler's persecution. But growing up, never did I hear anything negative about Jews. Never did I hear anybody identify, oh, that's a Jew. Never even heard about it. So I am looking from that perspective, I am looking at Jews in Israel. And I'm observing they are very attached to their history. And their history, they trace it thousands of years back, and there was they were enslaved in Egypt, they were enslaved in Babylon, they were persecuted here and there and many, many places. And when you talk about what I said about earlier, that after going through a lot of hard knocks, after having experienced a lot of hard knocks, most people come to a point where they start to embody the golden rule. So when you have a people that are so focused on having been persecuted by others, I am expecting, from my level of consciousness, that those people would be the last people to persecute another group. In other words, when the Jews were given Israel as their homeland, I would expect that the Jews in Israel would be the last people to persecute and discriminate against the people who lived there, the Palestinians. That's just my expectation. And you can see whether you agree with that. You can see whether you think the Jews are living up to it or not. I'm sure many are, but certainly doesn't look like the state of Israel is right now living up to that. And I think that's a reasonable explanation or expectation from us in the democratic countries to have. If we are, and Israel was created based on primarily the democratic world. It exists because of support from the democratic world. And I think it's a reasonable expectation to have, and it's a reasonable demand to make. As you see the democratic nations, they are starting to say, maybe this is a little too much, but they haven't really wanted to come out and say it, but I think that's what needs to happen. Anyway, that's probably besides the point. I mean, the question is, how do we as spiritual people avoid being disturbed by it? And as I've said, my view is, if they're in the school of hard knocks, if they won't listen to the ascended masters above, if they won't listen to us here below, they must be allowed to just outplay the hard knocks. And why should I feel empathy for it? Why should I feel disturbed by it? And, if you are a spiritual person, if you are open to ascended masters, they have given quite a lot of invocations, some of them specifically for the Middle East. And you can find them on my website, transcendencetoolbox.com. And if you feel like doing something about the Middle East or another situation, you can find invocations there for many world issues. And so you can give them, and then you can feel you are really doing what you can do from your perspective, And then you can be at peace with that and just allow the situations to outplay. You have to realize always, you can call to the Ascended Masters, but they are not going to go against the law of free will. So again, if people are in the School of Hard Knocks, but what you can do is you can call for the Ascended Masters to bind the dark forces that are influencing the people who are in conflict. And that might set them free to make a better choice. So there are many things you can do as a spiritual person. But I think the main thing is not be disturbed by it, because what do we do when we're disturbed by it? We misqualify energy of a lower vibration, and that doesn't help the situation at all. So that has kind of been my approach. You know, what do I need to do? I mean, again, I was disturbed by the Ukraine war, so I did what I always do and say, why am I reacting so strongly to this? What do I need to do here? What separate selves do I have from past lives that I need to overcome? So I can simply look neutrally at the situation and allow people to outplay what they need to outplay. And I also, as I said, you know, I can't allow myself to go into a negative reaction because I'm misqualifying energy. And I obviously don't want to do that because it just increases the burden on the planet. So I have to do whatever I can do to avoid that misqualifying energy, which means not putting my attention on every gory detail, but also looking at the separate selves that I have that cause me to react. So, as I said, the video about is the world getting worse or better? Watch that, and watch my avatar videos. And I think this will help you at least get started on developing a more positive attitude. I was just the other day watching a YouTube video with a man who had had a near-death experience. And he had been shown that in the coming decades, there's going to be kind of like a dividing of the way among people. And he said there's a group of people who will focus on the positive and the spiritual potential and the spiritual opportunities. And they will go up. Then there's a group of people who will not want to change. And they will go into a downward spiral and either destroy each other or self-destruct. And I was struck by that because it's very similar to what the Ascended Masters have been saying for a long time. As we move from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, there is a shift, and some people will flow with that shift, and some people will not. So I think it's important when we are spiritual people that we keep in mind that we don't help the planet progress by focusing on the negatives. It doesn't mean we should ignore the negatives. There's a fine balance to find. You know, Jesus said it 2,000 years ago, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. So we need to understand what's going on, but we don't need to put our attention on it to the point where we misqualify energy, go into a negative. And we don't need to look at every terrible thing that's happening, every terrible prophecy about the world ending next week. And so we have to be careful and ask ourselves, am I part of the upward spiral or part of a downward spiral? You know, and as spiritual people, it's very important to be in the upward spiral. As I've talked about in several videos, the Ascended Master Saint Germain is going to be the main spiritual overseer for Earth the next 2,000 years. And he has plans for creating a golden age. But that golden age will be manifest by the people who are tuning in to the positive, to the upward spiral. Not by those who tune in to all the negatives, all the doomsday prophecies, and not the people who are going into this black and white thinking of, oh, either the world goes to hell or we have paradise on earth, you know. Either this person is elected president and we are saved, or if he isn't elected president, the country will go to hell. I mean, it's, you know, these are not the kind of people who will be able to log into the positive spiral. You simply have to make a choice, you know. And you want to go up with the most spiritual people, or do you want to go down with the most negative people? It's basically the choice we are facing here as spiritual people.